1969, Quang Tri Province, Vietnam. The monsoon had just begun. Rain fell in sheets so dense it erased the horizon, turning the jungle into a black ocean of sound. The trees dripped, leeches swelled, and the air hung heavy with rot and cordite. A small patrol of North Vietnamese soldiers trudged along a flooded trail, their rifles wrapped in oilcloth, their eyes hollow with fatigue. They were veterans, men who had stared death in the face too many times to flinch at it now. One of them, a lieutenant with a cigarette clinging to his lip, laughed as thunder rolled across the valley. "The Americans think they can scare us," he said, kicking at a skull half buried in the mud. "They drop bombs, and when that fails, they drop their voices, machines talking in the night." The others chuckled. One mimicked the nasal tone of an American radio announcer. Another spat into the river and muttered, "Let them come. We don't fear ghosts." And then, through the wind and rain, came the sound. At first, barely audible, a woman's voice, carried on a broken frequency. Soft, mournful, human. "My husband, why did you not come home?" The laughter faltered. The lieutenant froze, eyes narrowing. The voice continued, trembling and desperate, like someone calling from beyond the grave. "The earth is cold. I cannot find the way. Please, help me." Every man stood still. The sound seemed to come from everywhere, from the trees, from the mud beneath their boots, from the air itself. A child's cry followed, then whispers, then screaming. The lieutenant shouted for silence, but even his voice trembled. The jungle had turned against them. They fired blindly into the dark. The echoes didn't fade, they multiplied. The rain swallowed their shouts, until only the weeping remained. Later, those who survived would swear they had heard the souls of their fallen comrades wandering the battlefield, calling out for burial. They would say the forest itself had become haunted. What they didn't know was that this was no ghost. It was a creation, built by men who understood fear better than death itself. And that night, under the relentless rain of Quang Tri, they weren't just hearing the dead. They were hearing the first whispers of psychological warfare's most terrifying weapon. They thought it was superstition. They thought it was just sound. What they didn't know was that they were listening to the beginning of their own unraveling. It began not in the jungle, but in an air-conditioned room in Saigon. Fluorescent lights buzzing, tape reels spinning, cigarette smoke hanging over a desk full of half-empty coffee cups. The U.S. Army's 6th Psychological Operations Battalion was running out of ideas. Vietnam was a war of ghosts, enemies that vanished into the trees, villages that changed sides overnight, and a population guided as much by ancient belief as by ideology. The Americans had firepower, technology, and money, but the Viet Cong had faith. That's when someone, no one remembers who exactly, said the unthinkable. If they fear the spirits of the dead, what if we become the dead? From that sentence, a project was born. Its codename, Operation Wandering Soul. The concept was simple and horrifying. Use the enemy's deepest spiritual convictions against them. In Vietnamese folklore, a person who dies far from home without proper burial rites is doomed to wander the earth forever, trapped between worlds. To the living, those souls cry out in anguish. So the engineers and linguists of the 6th PSYOP unit went to work. They hired local actors, monks, and translators. They recorded chants, laments, and the slow heartbeat of funeral drums. They layered the cries of women over the moans of the dead. The final mix didn't sound human anymore.
It sounded haunted. Each line of the tape was designed to hit a nerve. A son's voice calling to his father. A soldier begging his comrades to return home before they shared his fate. A ghostly priest performing an eternal funeral. They called it Ghost Tape Number 10. And it was unlike anything the U.S. military had ever created. The technical side was a nightmare. The jungle humidity warped tapes within days. The reel-to-reel players jammed. Speakers blew out mid-test. At one point, an engineer collapsed after 30 hours of editing. He said the sound got into his head. Commanders were skeptical. Colonel Sanders, no relation to the chicken magnate, called it hippie nonsense. Another officer reportedly said, "We're fighting communists, not children afraid of bedtime stories." But the PSYOP unit pushed on. They modified frequencies, experimenting with infrasonic waves below the threshold of hearing, the kind that make your chest tighten, your skin crawl, your body panic without knowing why. Each new version went deeper into the subconscious. They weren't just building a sound. They were building a psychological contagion. Still, the first field tests were failures. The tapes distorted in the rain. Local allies said the voices sounded too American. One Vietnamese translator told the team, "It's not fear yet, it's just noise." But somewhere beneath those early missteps, beneath the hissing speakers, the skeptical reports, and the laughter of generals, something was taking shape. Something designed not to destroy flesh, but faith. Not to wound the body, but the mind. A weapon born not of metal or fire, but of silence, grief, and sound. No one imagined that this crude, broken experiment, dismissed as superstition wrapped in science, carried within it the seed of victory.
The first time the ghost tape left the safety of Saigon, it wasn't carried in a convoy or guarded by soldiers. It was packed inside a dented ammo crate, labeled Audio, Civilian Morale Program. No one wanted to take responsibility for it. It was the summer of 1969. The Mekong Delta was a swamp of heat and paranoia. The jungles hummed with cicadas. The rivers ran brown with rain and blood. Somewhere near the Cambodian border, a PSYO unit mounted a set of oversized speakers onto a UH-1 Huey gunship. The plan was simple. Fly low over suspected Viet Cong positions and broadcast the tape at full volume. The pilot wasn't thrilled. "You're telling me we're flying through enemy fire to play a mixtape of ghosts?" he said, half joking. But the order was clear. At 2100 hours, the engines roared and the helicopter lifted into the night. Below, the jungle swallowed the sound of the blades. Then, play. Static. Then, the moaning began. The voice of a man, slow and tortured, spoke in Vietnamese. "My friends, I am dead. I died far from home. Do not end up like me. Go home before it is too late." The crew sat in silence, listening to the haunting words drift into the black canopy below. The sound seemed to vanish into the void. No movement, no panic, no gunfire. Nothing. Hours later, they returned to base. The debrief was short and brutal. No confirmed retreat, no reports of enemy disturbance, equipment malfunction due to humidity, mission inconclusive. The commanding officer underlined a single sentence in his report. The device lacks tangible combat utility. The tape was ridiculed. Soldiers called it the ghost mixtape. Others said it was proof America had lost its mind. One analyst joked that the only thing it scared was the helicopter crew. Weeks later, a ground team tried again. They placed loudspeakers in a rural village suspected of harboring Viet Cong. The villagers, confused, covered their ears. A few cried, not from fear, but from anger. To them, it felt like mockery. The propaganda failed. The technology failed. The theory failed. It became a running joke in the barracks. The report says it flies like a brick and screams like one too. Psychological warfare, it seemed, had met its own humiliation. The project was quietly shelved. Tapes gathered dust in metal cabinets. Engineers were reassigned. The audio team went back to making recruitment jingles and radio spots. To the brass, it was a dead end, a waste of money chasing superstition. But deep down, a few of the PSYO technicians refused to give up. They replayed the recordings late at night, headphones pressed tight, taking notes on pitch and tone. One of them, Sergeant First Class William C. Haynes, wrote in his log, "It doesn't fail because it's weak. It fails because it's too clean. The dead don't speak clearly." He was right. At that moment, the ghost tape wasn't yet a weapon. It was just an echo, a whisper, lost in the wind. The enemy laughed. Command laughed louder. But in war, laughter never lasts long.
It happened almost by accident, as many turning points in war do. July 1970, the Ah Shau Valley, a place soldiers called the Valley of Death. Dense canopy, constant fog, and an enemy that could melt into the earth itself. American patrols entered that jungle and rarely came back whole. That night, a platoon from the 6th PSYOP Battalion was ordered to assist a Marine operation, mostly for morale, not combat. They brought with them an old, nearly discarded reel of ghost tape number 10. The reel was warped, the labels smeared, the recording partially degraded. They had nothing else to lose. They mounted loudspeakers onto M113 armored carriers. Static hissed. The tape whirred unevenly. The sound that came out wasn't clean like before. It was distorted, broken, almost inhuman. And that's what made it real. Through the mist and darkness, the valley filled with the sound of a dying soul crying for release. A male voice, cracked and distant. "Brother, it's so cold here, I can't find the light. Go home before it's too late." The distortion turned every syllable into agony. The echo bounced off the mountains, twisting and multiplying until it felt like 1,000 ghosts screaming at once. Across the valley, North Vietnamese sentries froze. Some fired blindly into the fog. Others dropped their rifles and ran into the trees. Radio intercepts captured fragments of terrified voices, soldiers whispering about wandering spirits, about the dead returning to call them home. At dawn, when the Marines advanced, they found trenches abandoned, fire still burning, weapons left behind. No bodies, just footprints leading north, retreat. For the first time, the ghost tape had done what no bullet could. It had made the enemy believe. The after-action report was cautious, but different this time. Unexplained mass desertion, possible psychological disruption due to sound propagation. Recommend further controlled experiments. The brass didn't want to admit it, but something had changed. A weapon mocked as a joke had suddenly drawn blood, without shedding any. The engineers got to work.
They studied the acoustics of the jungle, the way humidity and foliage warped frequencies. They learned that low-end vibrations, 18 to 19 hertz, produced panic, nausea, and disorientation. They added them subtly beneath the voices. They called it Layer 0. Then they modified the voice tracks. Each version was custom-tailored for region and dialect, Northern, Central, Southern Vietnamese. They even incorporated local myths and death rituals. Soon they had created an auditory virus, something that seeped into the subconscious before the brain could defend itself. One psychologist described it this way: they didn't hear a sound, they felt a presence. From that point on, Operation Wandering Soul was reborn, no longer a failed experiment, but a weapon of cultural warfare. The American soldiers who carried the speakers didn't fully understand it, but they knew one thing. Every time the tape played, the jungle fell silent. No gunfire, no ambush, no enemy. Only the sound of ghosts whispering through the trees. That was the invisible turning point, the night when science, superstition, and terror fused into one. A weapon not made of steel or fire, but of faith itself.
By 1971, the ghost tape had evolved from a curiosity into a full-fledged instrument of fear. What began as a crude experiment of sound had become an invisible storm, carried not by jets or artillery, but by the wind itself. The operation expanded. Helicopters, patrol boats, and even foot soldiers were equipped with portable loudspeakers. The tapes were played during night patrols, ambushes, and siege operations. The jungle became a theater of sound. No more words, only wails, whispers, and the slow pulse of funeral drums echoing through the trees. Villagers heard it first. They would wake in the dead of night to hear voices calling from the hills. Sometimes it was a weeping mother. Sometimes a soldier begging forgiveness. Sometimes an entire chorus of the damned. The sound crawled under their skin. They said the forest had become haunted, that the Americans had harnessed the spirits of the fallen. And in a sense, they had. Captured Viet Cong defectors began reporting haunted zones. Whole units refused to patrol at night. Superstitious commanders performed counter-rituals, burning incense, chanting prayers, placing offerings at the forest's edge before entering combat. One North Vietnamese officer wrote in his diary, "The enemy has learned to speak to our dead. The spirits fight on their side now." In Saigon, PSYOP engineers analyzed every reaction. They discovered a pattern. Fear spread faster than gunfire. One successful broadcast could empty an entire valley by morning. And they refined it further. The new generation of tapes, versions 10B through 13, use directional phase modulation, a sound design technique that made the voice appear to move in circles around the listener. Even with eyes closed, it felt like someone was whispering from behind you, then beside you, then inside your skull. Combined with infrasonic frequencies at 19 hertz, known to cause dizziness, panic, and visual hallucinations, the ghost tape became more than a message. It became an experience of dread. American radio operators reported strange side effects, too. Some said they felt uneasy, nauseous, like the jungle was breathing. One technician destroyed a tape after hearing what he swore was his own name whispered in the background. But the results were undeniable. Morale among enemy troops began to fracture. Entire platoons deserted, refusing to re-enter haunted sectors. U.S. intelligence intercepted frantic transmissions. "Spirits in the forest, they call our names. We hear the souls of the dead, they want us to leave."
In one infamous operation, a platoon broadcast the tape for 3 consecutive nights in the Quang province. On the 4th morning, reconnaissance aircraft recorded no movement. The village was abandoned. Every hut empty, every tool left behind. A sergeant later described the moment, "It wasn't victory, it was absence. The jungle felt hollow, like we'd erased something human." Even the Americans began to sense it, a moral unease creeping beneath the tactical success. Was this warfare or witchcraft? Was this strategy or blasphemy? Still, the war machine pressed on. Commanders called it psychological leverage. Engineers called it psychoacoustic warfare. But the soldiers on the ground had a simpler name for it: the ghost that fights for us. From ridicule to reverence, the ghost tape had crossed a threshold. It was no longer about fear. It was about control. Control of the air. Control of belief. Control of the human mind. And as the broadcast spread deeper into enemy territory, one truth became clear. The Americans no longer needed to see their enemies to defeat them. They just had to make them listen.
By 1972, the ghost tape was no longer a curiosity whispered about in PSYOP briefings. It was a doctrine, codified, studied, and quietly feared. What began as superstition had evolved into philosophy, the philosophy of control through perception. In the sterile halls of MACV headquarters in Saigon, officers debated the implications. Could belief itself be turned into a battlefield? Could the mind, not the body, become the decisive terrain of war? For centuries, armies had fought to destroy what the enemy could see. Now they fought to command what the enemy could imagine. The doctrine was simple but brutal in logic. If your enemy's strength is faith, you do not attack his weapons, you attack his faith itself. If he fights for the dead, you make him fear the dead. American analysts began to call it the sonic divide. It wasn't about sound, it was about dominance, a clash between rational warfare and metaphysical terror. The U.S. had harnessed technology not just to strike, but to haunt. Engineers spoke in the language of decibels and resonance. Psychologists spoke of archetypes, trauma, and cultural imprinting. Together, they built a weapon that bridged the gap between circuitry and myth. Colonel Clyde Sanders, head of PSYOP Southeast Command, summarized it in one chilling memo. "We have found the thin membrane between sound and soul. Once breached, the target's resistance collapses without force." Meanwhile, the North Vietnamese High Command issued desperate internal bulletins urging troops to ignore phantom transmissions. But soldiers knew better. Belief isn't erased by orders. Once a soldier thinks the enemy can control the voices of the dead, his world no longer obeys logic. That was the genius and the danger of the ghost tape. It exploited something deeper than fear: cosmic guilt. The terror of dying dishonored, unburied, forgotten. American strategists understood something their opponents did not. A human being's will to fight is built, not on courage, but on coherence, the feeling that the world makes sense. The ghost tape shattered that coherence. It said, "Your world is broken. Even your gods are ours now." For the Americans, it was proof that ideology could be hacked like a radio signal. For the Vietnamese, it was the nightmare of colonization reborn, a foreign power invading even the realm of the spirit. And yet, behind the cold efficiency, even the creators began to feel unease. Some questioned if they had gone too far. One audio specialist later admitted, "We didn't just make them afraid, we made them question reality itself. That's not victory, that's annihilation." Still, in the brutal calculus of war, it worked. Morale among enemy forces fractured. Superstition became a weaponized virus. And from that emerged a new understanding of power, not as the ability to destroy,
but the ability to redefine truth. The ghost tape became the ghost of modern warfare itself, the moment humanity learned that technology could colonize not just land or sky, but the human mind. In the jungles of Vietnam, sound had become sovereignty, and the nation that mastered it had found something more terrifying than dominance: the knowledge that belief could be engineered. By the end of the war, the jungle had gone quiet. The bombers had left. The bodies were buried, some properly, most not. But the sound lingered. Vietnamese farmers spoke of nights when the wind still carried voices, faint, weary, crying for home. They said it wasn't the dead speaking anymore, it was the memory of men who had tried to imitate them. The Americans packed up their gear, their tapes, their theories. Operation Wandering Soul was never mentioned in victory speeches or history books. It existed only in fragments, field reports, declassified memos, reels labeled psychological test material. Yet its echo endured. In Hanoi, years later, a North Vietnamese veteran was asked about it. He laughed bitterly. "The ghosts," he said, "they made us fear our own faith." The irony was complete. Those who once mocked the American obsession with machines had been defeated not by machines, but by beliefs turned against them. And those who wielded that weapon discovered it could wound the wielder too. In Saigon, one of the original PSYOPs engineers listened to the old tapes before returning home. He described hearing something in the final playback, not in the recordings, but beneath them. A rhythm, a pulse, like the beating of a heart. He realized with dread that it wasn't the enemy's fear he'd captured, it was humanity's capacity for it. They laughed when they heard it the first time, he said years later. They stopped laughing when they realized the laughter was part of the tape. The war ended, but the doctrine lived on, echoed in every modern battlefield where sound, sight, and data are used to fracture the mind before the body. From the jungles of Southeast Asia to the deserts of the Middle East, the ghost still wanders, wearing new names: PSYOPs, InfoWar, Deepfake. Because the ghost tape was never just sound. It was the moment mankind learned to weaponize imagination itself. And in that revelation lay the most haunting truth of all. You don't have to kill a man to defeat him. You just have to make him doubt what's real. The laughter of that night in Quang Tri, the arrogance, the disbelief, has long faded. Only the echo remains. It hums beneath the static of history, beneath the endless march of progress. The ghost spoke once, through speakers, through fear, through faith. And the world has never truly gone silent since. The thunder spoke, and the night never belonged to them again.